Amazing.
Ah.
Port Phillip Bay are dominated by 3 species: redneck stints, sharp-tailed sandpipers, curlew sandpipers. They're all generalists that can switch between tidal flats and non-tidal ponds and feed in both habitats. And when it comes to waders that are totally reliant on foraging on tidal flats, like curlews and knots and godwits, bar-tailed godwits, they're basically very uncommon in Port Phillip Bay, except in Swan Bay. And I think our shorebird fauna is basically adapted to what we've got on offer in Port Phillip Bay, and supratidal foraging grounds are part of that. Second line of evidence comes from modelling food intake. The shorebird intake rate of food, it's limited by the rate it can be ingested, and it takes longer to eat if you're eating very little items, it takes longer to get a big meal inside you. Redneck stints need to spend, we've calculated that redneck stints need to spend 52% of their day foraging to meet their energy needs. It's about 45% for sharp-tailed sandpipers and curlew sandpipers. For larger shorebirds, it's a smaller proportion still. And of course, the tide is high for half the day, so it's very marginal there for redneck stints. And quite marginal for sharp-tailed sandpipers and curlew sandpipers. And it gets even more marginal when you consider neap tides and spring tides. On a spring tide, when the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun are working together, you get big high tides, you get very low tides. The tidal flats are exposed for a long time at low tides, and there's a broad area exposed. In spring tides, we would think shorebirds would do better at feeding on the tidal flats. And when you actually look at their weights from the Western treatment plant, you find that those 3 small sandpipers actually gain weight during spring tides. But during neap tides, when the tidal flats are small and they're not exposed for very long, our shorebirds actually lose weight. And this happens in neap tides, and it can happen at other times too. So for instance, when we get strong southerlies in spring and winter in Victoria, you can actually go for a week at a trot on the Western treatment plant where tidal flats aren't exposed at all. So I think there's supratidal foraging opportunities we can give to birds in conservation ponds and the like are very important. A few years ago, 10 years ago, I worked with BirdLife Australia on a study of roosts of shorebirds and food resources in Port Phillip Bay. There's a report, which is the blue thing on the right of that subscription, on the right of your screen, if you want to follow it up in detail. But the map shows the sites that we looked at. And to cut a long story short, in most places we didn't think there was a roost problem, but Swan Bay and the Western treatment plant stood out as interesting sites. So just starting at Swan Bay, which is, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it's near Port Phillip Bay Heads. It's a large, fairly natural system, lots of seagrass beds and tidal flats. Here's a closer up map on the bottom right. We did a radio tracking project there, and broadly what we found was, well, first looking at the coastal obligates, the species that only feed on tidal flats, grey plover, bar-tailed godwits, and we strongly suspect red knots. They foraged on the tidal flats of Swan Bay, which are shown here in light blue. They're quite big tidal flat systems with nice seagrass cover. Those birds didn't roost around Swan Bay because roosting habitat's a little bit thin. It's quite heavily vegetated. So they roosted on sand islands on dredge spoil from the ferry that runs across Port Phillip Bay Heads, or they roosted on mud islands on a sandbank there. And that's where they commuted from. So they flew several kilometres each day to get to the tidal flats on Swan Bay and then go to the roosts that were suitable. We also tracked redneck stints and sharp-tailed sandpipers, and they behaved a bit differently. They were a bit more tolerant of the roosts that were available around the margins of Swan Bay. They were using salt marsh habitats and so on that the sort of exclusively coastal waders, and which tend to be more wary, didn't like. But there was an interesting thing. At one point, Lake Victoria, which is a few kilometres away from Swan Bay, it's shown here, The water levels became shallow enough for it to be used by shorebirds, and every sharp-tailed sandpiper, sorry, every redneck stint that we had a radio tag on, and most of the sharpies that we had a radio tag on, they all vanished off the Lake Victoria. They totally left Swan Bay, which, well, I think they went to Lake Victoria because they could feed there 24 hours a day, and they considered it a better option than tidal flats at that particular time. Just shows the importance of supratidal sites. Finally, getting on to the Western Treatment Plant, which was what Chris actually asked me to speak about. We've been looking at roost movements at the Western Treatment Plant for a long time. We is Arthur Rylah Institute with long sustained admirable support from Melbourne Water. One of the things we do at the treatment plant is we count the shorebirds there at high and low tide. And the graphs here show the, I've covered over something, but the pink dots are the counts that we get at low tide. The blue dots and the blue shading are the counts that we get at high tide. And what we found for most of the period that we've been doing these paired counts is that high and low tide counts are virtually identical, because shorebirds feed in the Western Treatment Plant and then they roost in other parts of the treatment plant. But in recent years, our high tide counts have become lower than our low tide counts, which strongly suggests that shorebirds are moving somewhere else at high tide. And we've done some other observational work, and we're pretty sure that the mystery site is Avalon Saltworks. So on these maps, the blue shaded area is the Western Treatment Plant. The red shaded area is Avalon Saltworks. It's the Western Treatment Plant is managed by Melbourne Water, and conservation values are very high in their thinking. They do a lot of work on conservation ponds for shorebirds. Avalon Saltworks is a disused salt field. It was a good shorebird site in the days when it was a commercial salt producer. The site then got mothballed for years and gradually deteriorated. It's recently been taken over by Parks Victoria, but serious management hasn't yet begun. So from 2004 to 2015, when we did our counts, and we also did a radio tracking study, we basically found that shorebirds fed on the foreshore of the Western Treatment Plant, and then they scattered between lots of different conservation ponds throughout the treatment plant, with a lot of them using the T section, Austin Road lagoons down here, and a handful of them using North Spit Island. The February 2020 map, which is an example of recent counts, now most shorebirds, they still feed on the foreshore of the Western Treatment Plant, but a large proportion of them, but sometimes, are totally leaving the treatment plant. They're flying 15 kilometres to Avalon Saltworks to roost. And several of the roosts that they used to use in the treatment plant are hardly used anymore. This picture it's not absolutely the same in every survey. So this was the last one we did in January. We had lots of birds, sort of 10,000 odd birds, feeding on the foreshore between Beach Road and the mouth of Little River, 145 West Outfall. At high tides, a few of them went to Avalon, about 1,000 went to Avalon, but the great majority went to these barrier islands on North Spit, and a few others were roosting on wrack that happened to be floating opposite the treatment plant at the time. And in one way you can look at it and think that's quite good. So this time they didn't need to fly 15 kilometres to Avalon, which adds up to 60 kilometres a day when you consider going there and back by day and night. They didn't need to go so far, they just went to the Spits. But at Avalon, they can do some foraging at high tide in the ponds. Avalon's condition wasn't very good this year, and I think that's why the birds went to the Spits. They roosted there. There's lots of potential roosting habitat if all you want to do is rest on these barrier islands. That's a sort of 2 to 3 kilometre stretch that's got quite a lot of potential shorebird roosting habitat on it. But shorebirds can't feed there at all. So this year, in the most recent survey, they went to the Spits. It's debatable whether this is better than avalon, and it's certainly not as desirable as feeding in conservation ponds very close to the foraging site. So why are roost movements changing at the treatment plant? I think there's less foraging habitat for the conservation ponds in the treatment plant than there used to be. And I should emphasise at this point that I'm not blaming Melbourne. This is not a dig at Melbourne Water. I think they've done an absolutely wonderful job of managing these conservation ponds over many years. It's just a really difficult job, and there are challenges to face. The problem in a lot of the ponds is vegetation encroachment. Shorebirds don't like tall things. Vegetation's gradually getting into the ponds. For many years, Melbourne Water's held the vegetation problem at bay through careful water management. They flood the ponds for most of the year. They draw, and any vegetation gets killed by drowning, by grazing coots and swans. And then they draw down the water levels at a particular time of year when it's useful to shorebirds. And it's worked very well for a long time, but just gradually the vegetation is winning. Also, there were some ponds that were good for shorebirds during construction phases. The construction's now complete, so it's not unexpected that those particular ponds have fallen off. But it does mean Melbourne Water's got challenges ahead, which they are looking at now, but they've got to find other ways to control some of the ponds. It's difficult, intrusive, expensive. So to go back to the original brief from Chris, how can we improve roosting options for shorebirds in the Western Treatment Plant area? The first question we need to ask is, do we need to provide more habitat where shorebirds can rest safely, or do we need to provide more habitat where they can feed at high tide? I come down emphatically in favour of the latter point. I think there's quite a lot of places in the treatment plant where shorebirds can rest safely, including some of the roosting platforms that were put there, but there were already plenty of options on barrier islands and some tracks and so on. I think we need to provide more habitat where shorebirds can feed at high tide. And where is pond management needed most? I've put together this sort of table summarising some pros and cons. So in the top two rows, you've got the Western Treatment Plant. Challenges: most of the conservation ponds are freshwater. Vegetation encroachment is very difficult to control in shallow freshwater. The pros of working at managing ponds at Melbourne Water, the Western Treatment Plant: firstly, it's managed by Melbourne Water. They're really skillful at management ponds and have demonstrated a strong commitment to it over many years. And secondly, the conservation ponds of the treatment plant are very important, close to the important foraging grounds between Beach Road and 145 West Outfall. At Avalon, challenges. It's 15 kilometres from Avalon to the feeding grounds at the treatment plant. So if shorebirds are going to Avalon at high tide, they've got 60 kilometres an hour of energetic costs every day, so that's not perfect for them. Bigger issue at Avalon: there's very little control over water level in the ponds. There's some input from rainfall, but it's very unpredictable, and in dry years there's virtually none. There's very few resources for managing the water levels there, and at the moment the only pump that was flooding some very important parts of the saltworks is broken, and I don't know where they're at replacing it, or if there's any plans afoot. On the other hand, there are some good things to be done at some good things about shorebirds management at Avalon. The ponds are brackish to salty, and it just stops vegetation getting established there. So if you look at the pictures on the right, top right is the Western Treatment Plant, a freshwater pond. You see those exposed areas of mud. They're exposed because Melbourne Water had drawn them down at the time the photograph was taken. Fantastic. That site will be great shorebird habitat for a month or so. If that mud is then left there for, let's say, 3 months, it's a bit of a guess. But that grass on the right, it will just encroach over the mud flats, and it will hopefully be killed next time you flood the wetland. But if the vegetation gets too big and rhizomes get established, then that's just going to be a grassy patch, no matter how high you flood the mud flat next time. On the other hand, this pond below at Avalon That's a salt pond that's often dry. It happens to have been flooded by water. Brine shrimp took off in it. Presumably eggs had been left in the soil, and it just got a bit of rain. It was great for banded stilts. And when it dried out again, it didn't have a vegetation problem because it was too salty for vegetation. So management in saltworks and a freshwater pond is really quite different. And at Avalon, we'd have to learn quite a lot about how to manage water levels for shorebirds. And finally, the way ahead. This is as I see it. It's not an official ARI view. I don't even know if Melbourne Water will agree with it, but it's how I feel about it. I feel that floating roosts are not the solution to managing roost problems at the Western Treatment Plant in Avalon, because floating roosts are not really important feeding sites for shorebirds. Floating roosts could have applications elsewhere in Port Phillip Bay, and I do wonder about mud islands, where the only remaining shorebird roost that I'm aware of is quite a small spit that I think gets covered on the very largest tides. There's some disturbance problems there. Floating roosts might, if you persevered with them in Port Phillip Bay, I think mud islands might be worth considering. But more seriously, for Werribee Avalon, I think supporting Melbourne Water in their efforts to improve pond quality for shorebirds at the Western Treatment Plant is important. Melbourne Water's aware of the issues and they're working on them. They're doing some good hydrological studies and other things. So I'm not the best person to talk about what they're doing, but they're certainly active. And finally, we should probably acknowledge that there may be times when it simply isn't possible to provide good shorebird roosts with foraging habitats at the Western Treatment Plant. There's a limited number of conservation ponds. You can only activate them for a shortish time each year because of the risk of vegetation encroachment. So if we could identify those times when it's most difficult to provide shorebird roosting habitat at the treatment plant, that would be the time when it's most important to provide alternate roosts at Avalon. But if we go down that route, a final very important point is we have to get water levels under control at Avalon. There needs to be some way of pumping water in, better control of water in the sluices, a plan for when ponds and how ponds are managed for shorebirds. I think it's high priority, and it's probably the most efficient way that money could be spent to improve roosting options for shorebirds at the treatment plant. And I think I've got everything off my chest there. Are you still on screen?
Fantastic, thanks Danny. That's a very thorough analysis of shorebird movements and changes in roosting behaviour in Port Phillip Bay, and thanks for your final thoughts there on which we'll revisit, I think, in the discussion period because we're a little bit behind, but some really interesting points, particularly around plasticity and behaviour of some species that require high tide foraging, which species might require supertidal ponds, and yeah, what the best way forward for Port Phillip Bay population would be. So really interesting. I unfortunately don't have time to give Danny direct questions right now, but I'll be recording it, Danny, so if anybody has particular questions, we can forward those on.
Yeah, and I'm afraid I do have to go now, but if you have questions, please get in touch.
Many thanks again, Danny.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye.
Okay. Bye. Okay, so we'll just continue here with the floating roost situation. So now that we've heard what was happening in, or what is happening currently in Port Phillip Bay, and we have an idea about the more dire situation in the LAC, particularly the Coombe Estuary, I'll get onto how we sought to. Is that's shared, everybody? Just give me a nod. Yep, great. Okay, so the Floating Roost Trial was based on existing aquaculture infrastructure, which was developed in Australia to increase yield of oysters and reduce impacts on intertidal ecology. We had incidental reports of shorebirds roosting on these platforms, particularly threatened species like bar-tailed godwit and eastern curlew piqued our interest. So I went up to Merimbula, tasted a few oysters and did some research and came back with some interesting points. So the floating roost bags system, so initially I had thought them as just a roosting site, as Danny said, but they do actually provide some high tide foraging, and we witnessed while we were at the oyster leases high tide foraging on the bags, because they almost contain their own little microcosms. So they're consistent through the tide level, so they raise and lower with the tide. They're immune to terrestrial predators because you can place them wherever you'd like, and essentially they create little islands. They're immune to vegetation colonisation with an asterisk, so we'll get to that later. And they're very adaptable, and they're cheap and they're low impact. They're really easy to install. Now that I've got the hang of it, I'd be confident to give me a few days with an extra hand, some muscle, maybe 2 extra people, I could install a floating roost of the size that we were looking at, which is 3 lines of 40 bags long each, so 120 bags within a couple of days. So very adaptable, you can change them around very easily, and very resilient, as opposed to some of the traditional methods. So if we look down, so Port Phillip Bay was, of course, Korea was going to be our end target, and that's our ultimate goal and where the major problem is. But we couldn't just up stumps and drop this onto them as a trial. So we wanted to do a proof of concept in Port Phillip. So as Daniel described, the necessity is not as urgent, and certainly there are plenty of habitat availability still, particularly within conservation ponds, salt and the salt works. So it was just to see whether birds, given the option, might actually use them. So the necessity, again, wasn't particularly there, but given the option, might they opportunistically use them? So we installed them in 3 very sort of disparate sites, which gave us an idea of the different habitat effects that might occur. So the Spit Conservation Reserve is a natural sheltered coastal lagoon. The T section, as Danny described, is a system of freshwater ponds managed by Melbourne Water for conservation values. Supratidal, and Little River Estuary is an exposed intertidal area, so subject to a lot of weather from the bay, and can get quite a bit of wave action and get covered in wrack and algae. One of our more exposed sites, but not as exposed as where some of the oyster leases are. Now, having said that, there are, of course, a lot of existing roosting options for these birds. So, like I said, re-emphasising, the Port Phillip Bay trial was a proof of concept. The necessity wasn't really there. So there are still thousands of birds roosting within the conservation ponds. But nevertheless, we did test how they went. So, and we got some pretty instantaneous results from a suite of species, including some of the target species, the migratory shorebirds. We also got interesting results from a suite of other threatened species, including fairy terns and the like. So with that knowledge, we went out and deployed, we got approval to do a trial in Korea, and we deployed that in April 2019. Obviously the desperation and the necessity was far higher in the LOC for these birds. So we got the install done within a couple of days, 3 of us, so local Youngmin Moon and Kangaroo Island oyster farmer Bob Nichols. And as soon as we got the bags in and climbed back up the seawall, 2 Terric sandpipers landed on the roost. So just showing their desperation, they had been circling in flocks of tens of thousands. And then shortly after, we had 20 or 30 birds. Then that got up to 300 birds, 400, and then peaked in southern migration. We reached capacity at one of our roost sites, just really, which was encouraging to show that they would use the roosts. Also pretty sad and enlightening. So the absolute desperation of these birds. There are around over 500 birds squeezed into one of our roost sites, and jostling for position, coming and going, because there is such a limit of roost sites in these areas. So proof of concept was there. we know that shorebirds use these sites when the necessity is there and that they are appropriate. So the overlap was there and the validation to an extent was there, but we need to analyse a little bit more and drill down into it. So now I'll just give you an idea of some of the results that we had, okay? So this is both from the Korean trial and the Australian trial. Across the two sites, we have 58 species of waterbirds using the roosts. And a lot of this work was done by monitoring using remote sensors. So there are limitations in that. Obviously, we couldn't have somebody out watching these things throughout the whole tide cycle, 24/7, throughout the whole year. So we were limited to giving a 20-second to 15-second recording once every hour throughout the whole tide cycle, throughout the whole year. So not just the peak shorebird seasons and not just the high tide. So all these results, consider them right across the tide cycle, right across the year. So they might be negatively inflated by non-migratory times and low tides. So we had 21 species of shorebirds across the two sites, including most of the threatened species we get here in Australia, including eastern curlew, red knot, great knot, greater sand plover, and eastern curlew. We had maximum abundance, and curlew sandpiper, importantly. We had maximum abundance of greater than 500 birds, as you saw in that last slide. And we found that site selection is one of the most important variables dictating whether a roost is used or not. So you can see on the right, we have two of the Korean roosts, Seoul-ri and Jungwoo Bay. So only tens of kilometres apart from each other, but very different results. And then the three Western treatment plant sites, again, one different from the other, and each with very different species lists of occurrence and very different abundances and regularity of use. So naturally, here we have a look at the Korean results again, which is our ultimate target. We had peak results, so every day during the peak migration, during May, every day of May during northern migration, there was a use of the roost. So shorebirds use the roost 100% of the time during May and October during southern migration, showing that there is just a huge necessity for them at these peak migration times when there's a huge flux of birds coming through. And different species have different phenology and filtering through at different times, but these appear to be the two periods when there's the biggest necessity for roosting, additional roosting capacity. Now, Oakley Gurmich was able to run these recordings. So he had thousands of recordings to look through, had to subsample them because there was just too much to go on. But we were able to compare them to local variables like wind speed, weather, ambient temperature, wind speed, and tide. And you can see on the right the significant predictors to whether shorebirds would use the floating roosts are wind speed, the weather, the ambient temperature, and the max daily tide. So this is an interesting one. So what the tide is going to be during that day, not what the tide is at the time of roosting, but what the tide is going to be that day. So as Danny was explaining, those spring tides, when the mudflats are covered for the longest period of the day, it was found that even if the tide wasn't high yet, birds would predict that the tide was going to be a spring tide and start using the roost early, and then sometimes remain on the roost for longer periods than if there was going to be a lower tide that day. So it wasn't particularly the time of the high tide, but almost the anticipation that there was going to be a max daily high tide that was going to preclude them from roosting at other sites. So that was an interesting outcome. And this photo up the top, not shorebirds as you can tell, but just to show that we had a suite of species, also off-target species like the internationally endangered black-faced spoonbill. This is in Korea, and Chinese egrets and great egrets and grey herons using the site regularly. But the black-faced spoonbill of particular international conservation concern using the roosts. Now, site selection, as I said, is one of the highest predictors, but also timing. So we had interesting times where shorebirds would almost completely ignore a site, but as Danny was describing, the smaller shorebirds in particular, because they need to be feeding and changing their behaviour, have a bit more plasticity in their behaviour to where they're feeding and when they're roosting. So as I said, weren't able to pick up everything with the remote cameras, and some observations were just opportunistic. And this is just an example of that when we went down to the Western Treatment Plant in January this year. And Melbourne Water, as part of their management process, were emptying out some of the Western lagoons, which are known feeding and roosting sites for small shorebirds. And that very same day, Danny had up to 6,000 birds roosting on the spit, and our spit roost was jam-packed full of shorebirds as well. So we had 65 shorebirds there of 5 different species utilising the roost. So it does change temporarily in roost availability, and shorebirds can certainly show some plasticity. They will find the roost if they need to, if it's close enough to their feeding grounds and existing roosts. And so that was one of the very important points. So roost location is the most important variable. So between the regions and also among sites within a region. So if you're considering installing roosts in your region and you think that you've got such a dire situation that a floating roost would be required even temporarily until you can restore natural roosts. One of the key limitations which we put on it was the site of that roost and in comparison to existing habitat. So within this map, you can see this Zhanghan coast. All the red dots are the first to be covered by the tide. So birds transition from these sites, 1, 2, 3, and 13. They'll move away from these sites first and become more concentrated in the orange sites, then the yellow sites, and finally the green sites, which are the supersite tidal sites. So all the shorebirds from all of these dots eventually need to become concentrated in these 2 sites. And these are 2 supertidal artificial sites, but the 2 sites where we put them, number 4, where we put roost, 4 and 5, differed from each other in the timing. So 4, Janggu Bay, was actually a transitional roost. So birds would transition from 1, 2, 3, move on to 4, and then when the tide came higher, they would transition to Solree. So this is almost, on most tides, a terminal site. But when they're finally pushed off that, they'll move on. So we put a roost here, and that was the most used site and the site where we got regular and high abundance of shorebirds. So if you can put roosts that are going to have the lowest, the least path of resistance for birds to get back to feeding and roosting, that's where they should be. So they should be close to terminal roosting sites. And by doing that, you're also selecting sites which are naturally going to be less exposed to predators, less exposed to the elements, because shorebirds have already chosen them. And here is just another example of the timing. So here we have, up the top is the little river roost packed out with terns and gulls and a couple of shorebirds. But then a month later, there was a huge algal bloom and a lot of wrack formed a floating roost off the coast. So there was no necessity for the floating. So it all depends on what else is available. Another thing which we will talk about, and Alex from Deakin University will talk a little bit about, and about a study that Ryan's doing on thermal properties. So as Danny said, these birds want to keep and maintain a positive energy balance, and the thermal dynamics of roost are very important in doing so. So in Australia, hot summers can really preclude birds from roosting in certain areas, particularly on rocks at high tide roosts. And what we found is that the floating roosts, because they are this mesh bag, you can see here, filtered oysters, the water can filter through and the birds can maintain their feet wet throughout the tide, and that not only has heating but cooling processes. So it's, as you can see on the results below, the floating roosts had a more confined range of temperature than the natural roosts, which had a wider variation in their temperature just due to natural radiation at the site, heating of sand and cooling again at night time. Whereas water has an interlative property, which appears to be favourable for birds to roost at. So we'll hear from Alex about how we're doing better tests on that. We used thermologgers and lost quite a few, but we did get some interesting results to begin with. Shorebirds also use the increased structure as a novel shelter during low tides for roosting. Now, Danny touched on feeding. So here, just some additional results beyond our would shorebirds use them, and are they impacting natural ecology and the thermal initial goals. So these are just some opportunistic results that we hadn't been expecting. So shorebirds are, because the oyster bags, we fill them with oysters in the hopes that they would be colonised by intertidal communities. And within the aquaculture commercial industry, they flip the bags to stop them from spoiling, so to stop fouling within the bags and stop these communities from getting too dense. We wanted to encourage that to provide high tide foraging, and we soon found out that that was relatively easy. So some of these bags got filled with an amazing array of invertebrates, from polychaetes and amphipods and anemones and bivalves, some of which shorebirds were actively feeding on at the low and high tide end of the spectrum. So shorebirds were using the roost at low tide and at high tide, not only for roosting but for feeding. So that was an interesting outcome, and each site had its own suite of invertebrate communities which were colonising them. So another factor to think about when selecting site. More recently, we've had some shorebirds attempting to nest on them, which is, I guess, the ultimate form of flattery, that they consider that this habitat is safe enough and stable enough to have a nest. Several of them got to egg stage. There was a storm. We don't know. There were some hide stilt juveniles getting around locally. I don't know whether they actually fledged, but within one roost site, we had 6 nests in a single session. Now, the invertebrate communities within these sites also filter off into the surrounding water column. So they do provide high tide and low tide feeding opportunities for water birds and filter feeders who feed within the water column, like avocets and spoonbills, who almost use the rows of roosts as shopping aisles, going back and forth, feeding within them. And reports from the aquaculture guys say that this is, a bit of a problem for them, because there are fish nurseries almost formed within them. They're very safe within the bag, so small fish will go and start living within the bags and feeding and living there almost exclusively within one bag, get to a size where they're too big to escape from the 10mm mesh, and then they'll have to pull out large fish out of the bags before they cause damage to the oysters. So an opportunity, but also perhaps a risk. The other opportunities, obviously, we discussed the off-target species, so not just shorebirds, but potentially for things like fairy tern, black-faced spoonbill, or other water birds. Vegetation, we've had threatened salt marsh communities growing on some of them, despite the fact that we thought that these would be immune from salt marsh. And there could be social and economic benefits for local communities within production, or using or increased opportunities to farm oysters, indeed. So Lashna from RMIT will talk a little bit about that soon. Now, the limitations are it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So I spoke about the colonisation. So some of these bags got so heavily colonised that it caused damage to the physical structure of the roosts. So we left them out there for over 2 years, whereas mostly within the aquaculture business, they would flip them every couple of months and then take them out during the non-growing period. We wanted them to become colonised, but perhaps didn't anticipate how colonised some of these bags would become. Some of them didn't require any attention and have been sitting out there by themselves, but particularly the intertidal sites like Little River became heavy with colonial fanworms, which accumulate enormous amounts of sediment around them and anemones, and weighed the bag, almost tripled the weight of these bags. So they went from 4 kilograms up to nearly 12 kilograms. Now, this puts an enormous strain on the infrastructure, the ropes and the bag fastenings. Testing at the moment with the aquaculture guys has shown that the technical specs probably can't hold that much. So there's increased maintenance that needs to be done at sites where to preclude too much colonisation. So it's simply a matter of flipping the bags over. Monitoring, we still haven't got it down packed. As I said, the limitation of how the birds we might be missing, the events we might be missing, and how we might better monitor these roosts. Financial, we've had very generous support from a number of people who are on the line today, who are interested in this project, applications in Australia, but also overseas, and for the flyway. The financial limitations, we're a very small team and been running on the smell of an oily rag, but to take it forward and realise a better product, we'll need to get out there and raise some more money if that is the end game. Logistical, obviously, Korea is and the Yellow Sea are our 2 final destinations for these things. But COVID's put a bit of a kibosh on that, so I wasn't able to get over there last year and check on the roosts. And luckily, we've got very enthusiastic partners over there who have been maintaining them. But perhaps this gives us an opportunity to test out phase 2 on our perfect testing grounds here in Port Phillip Bay, and then take over a more realised product in 2022, 2023. And so, yeah, we probably need to increase our capacity by then and hope that travel restrictions have been lifted. And then the last limitation, of course, which Lashna will speak about at the end of this slide, is the environmental footprint. So the production value, the miles that the actual products have to travel. They are made of high-density polymer plastic, so they're relatively immune to breaking. We haven't lost a bag yet. Even in high-energy coastlines like Port Stephens, they have these grow oysters from these things in high-energy coastlines in Canada, where they are subject to huge wave action and don't lose any bags, but there is the risk of microabrasions. You can see the acorn barnacles encrusting this float here, and there's always going to be a risk of microplastic contributions into the surrounding environment. So trying to find an alternative to plastic would be the way to go. So I'll stop there because we're running a bit short on time. I might just move straight on to, actually, I'll take a few questions if there are any, and then we'll move on and hear from Lashna about how this alternate material study might be beneficial and how it's progressing. So does anybody have any questions at this point? If not, we can move straight on to Lashna. Okay, great. Lashna, you've got the floor.
Fantastic. Hello, everyone. Let me share my screen with you. Stop. Tell me if you can see my presentation in a moment. Okay. I think that should be okay. Share screen. Oh, I see. Okay, so I have some security. I have to fix my security settings. I'm on a Mac, sorry. So I have to give this access quickly. Sorry about that. Okay, I might have to just quit very briefly. I'll be back in 2 seconds. It just has to reboot. Sorry.
Perhaps is Alex there? Alex, are you happy to jump in?
Yeah, sure. I can.
Okay, we'll hear from Alex McQueen from Deakin about thermal studies first. Then.
Thank you. Sorry.
All right. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep, great.
Presentation, great. So, hi everyone. As Chris said, my name's Alex McQueen and I'm a postdoc researcher at Deakin University. And Chris has invited me to share our research plans to investigate whether the artificial roosts provide thermal refuges to birds in hot conditions. Our research is a team effort, and I especially wanted to highlight my honours student Ryan Barnaby, who's going to be joining me in the field and also working on this project as part of his honours thesis. So Ryan's also here today. So as Chris mentioned, the artificial roosts have the potential to provide cooler resting places for birds and also more stable environments when they roost. And so the aim of our study is to test whether or not this is the case, and so whether or not the artificial roosts do provide favourable thermal environments compared to natural roosts of sand and rock, whether the birds actively seek out these thermal refuges in hot conditions, and if they do so, whether or not they show less signs of being under heat stress on the artificial roosts. So we plan to investigate this by surveying the number of birds and the different species that use artificial and natural roosts during high tides. And we aim to relate this to the local climate conditions. So we use a portable weather meter here, which is on the picture on the left, to assess local air temperature, wind speed, humidity. We'll also look at cloud cover and wave action. And we'll use an infrared thermal camera to assess the surface temperature of the roost environment. So the infrared thermal camera works very much like a regular photography camera, but every pixel on the image represents underlying surface temperature data. So every pixel on the screen we can use to measure the surface temperature of the environment and also the birds. So here we have, for example, the center picture is one of the floating roosts at Spit Point. And you can see that the pixels are color coded to match the surface temperature. So the highest temperature here is around 23 degrees down to 11.2. And then on the right, we just have a natural roost at Point Cook with some terns sitting on there. So we aim to both directly compare the artificial roosts and nearby natural roosts, but also we hope to find target shorebird species where they're roosting. So actually actively seek them out, find when they're roosting, where they're choosing to roost at high tide and measure the conditions there and compare that with the artificial roosts. We also want to see any signs of heat stress experienced by the birds in the different environments. So here we have just an example of 2 silver gulls. And we're going to use the thermal camera to measure the surface temperature of the actual birds. But we're particularly interested in the surface temperature of their bills and also their legs, but particularly the bill, because when birds are heat stressed, they actually increase the blood flow to their bill, and they use this to radiate heat out into the environment. And this is an effective way for them to keep cool. So, for example, you can see here the silver gull on the left has a relatively cool bill compared to its body and relatively cool legs. This is taken in around 18 to 20 degrees environment, whereas the silver gull on the right, which is also panting, it's increased the blood flow to its bill and its legs. This is in a high 30-degree temperature environment, and it's using this in an attempt to cool down. And so we want to see, by looking at the behaviour of the birds at the different roosting sites, whether they're employing these behaviours to try and keep cool. This is using this kind of infrared thermal technology is really helpful because it's really non-invasive. All we need to do is sort of carefully approach the birds, take the image, and then we leave. We don't need to interfere with the birds in any way. And finally, we also want to look at the behaviours employed by the birds themselves. So behaviours such as panting, raising their back feathers, standing on one leg and tucking their bill away as evidence for how birds are thermoregulating in the different roost environments. So we predict that if birds are using the artificial roosts as thermal refuges, well, firstly, we predict that the artificial roost will provide cooler surfaces to stand on and more stable environments compared to the artificial roosts, compared to the natural roosts. And we also expect that the birds will actively favour use of the artificial roosts in hot conditions. We expect that the birds themselves will have cooler surface temperatures while they're on the artificial roost compared to the natural roosts, and that they'll show reduced outward signs of heat stress. So we expect reduced increase in blood flow to the bill, so cooler bill surface temperatures, and also a reduction of thermoregulatory behaviours that seem to indicate heat stress. So that's just a snapshot of what we plan to do. I'll just finish with some thermal footage of some silver gulls cooling down. And yeah, I'd just like to thank you for your input, and thanks especially also to Melbourne Water for allowing us to conduct this research on their land. Okay, thank you.
That's excellent. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, really exciting work, especially for any fans of the Predator movie series out there. Really cool stuff and innovative solution to the problems which we're trying to face with the thermologgers. Now, how are you going, Lashna? Are you
good? I'm back. I'm ready.
That's great.
Sorry about that.
You've conquered the security.
I have. Okay, so I will share my Acrobat window with you. Let me know when you can see it. How's that? Can you see my presentation?
Yep.
Great.
Yep.
Thank you. So I'm Lashna Tushevsky, and I'm an industrial designer on the project, working with RMIT through a master's program. And the master's program, as Chris introduced just before, is to identify the ways in which the existing roost system can be manufactured with environmentally benign and responsibly sourced natural materials while utilising near-site and local production methods. Yes, within South Korea, and we're also looking at materials in local to Victoria and New South Wales as well. So this project's design objectives or goals is to initially replace plastic components with natural...
Sorry, Lashna, we're just still on your viewer. So we're still on page 1.
Are you?
Yeah. So if you... I don't think we're on full screen.
Maybe this is better if I... Can you see it now?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Maybe I'll leave it like that just
sure.
to be more reliable. Sorry about that. So yes, to replace the plastic components, particularly the foam float and the mesh oyster bag, with natural environmentally benign materials and manufacturing processes while remaining durable in the application context. As mentioned in the previous slide, we're looking to utilise materials, methods and processes that are relevant to near-site production. And that could be through engaging local materials and material manufacturers and craft practitioners alongside volunteer makers in the production process. And of course, bird requirements. So meeting technical shorebird requirements inclusive of safety and possible feeding opportunities that Chris touched on in the last couple of slides he showed through the invertebrate growth, the promising invertebrate growth, which is really exciting. This project's also exploring the continued possibility to engage aquaculture outcomes and possible commercial fertilisation possibilities at the end of life of the product. So through strict environmental research, criteria and material targets, as mentioned on the left there, research has identified a selection of possible alternate materials and manufacturing processes complementary to the design objectives, which is really exciting. Alongside the material targets and goals mentioned, we're also looking at any energy efficient and reduced toxicity and pollution within the materials. So meeting durability constraints, possibly engaging a closed loop life cycle, and potentially even utilizing a waste stream for some of the material parts. So some of the materials that were particularly promising, I'll just touch on them briefly, some of the points that were quite interesting and hopefully can share some interesting results were bamboo. So bamboo is particularly durable within a saline or saltwater context, has well-established handcrafted processes and positive alignment with renewable and sustainability indicators as seen in the UN Sustainable Development Plan. Mycelium is another material that we're looking at. Its lightweight, high strength and hydrophobic properties are presenting some promising potential for the replacement of the foam float, as it's quite buoyant. Seaweed and algae we're also looking at. So as some of you I'm sure are very familiar, seaweed has promising carbon absorption qualities within the growth phase, and new science is informing kelp-based polymers used in fabric and 3D printed material applications, which is quite exciting. Glass foam and pumice are also being explored as potential float aid materials. So glass foam is a bioremedial water filtration. It's being used as water filtration material currently, and also utilizes a waste stream when utilizing glass fines. Grass, sedge and rush species are also showing some really promising results. In the prototyping phase, it's a fast-growing material. Again, it's resilient and has effective carbon absorption qualities as seen in the Spinifex species. Again, well-established handcrafted processes, which is fantastic. And species such as bulrush or kumbungi are classified as a weed and present an exciting waste stream product to be utilised. Bacterial cellulose or SCOBY is another material that we're exploring. It has a high tensile strength in its wet state and is quite fast growing and can feed from waste streams to grow. So material research has informed expansion on possible manufacturing methods, those of which are now being explored through form ideation and prototype creation. And there's a couple of photographs here of some of the prototypes that we've been playing with. Using those aligned materials that I just touched on, we're looking at handcrafts such as crochet and knitting. So that particular picture is crocheted bamboo yarn. We're looking at grown or mold-shaped mycelium. Mycelium can be shaped, as if you can see my mouse, can be shaped into a huge diverse range of mold shapes. So we're exploring that and the potential for that to be grown into a flat kind of bed shape. We have been exploring loomed weaving with golden kelp strands, as you can see just here. Open hand weaving with pandanus grass and macrame with bacterial cellulose. And these materials are currently also being tested in the simulated saltwater conditions to assess suitability within the saltwater context. And what we're looking for in these initial tests is for buoyancy, absorption of water, the rate of which the prototypes are absorbing water, the resilience to salt water, additional weight that can be supported within the prototypes. So can they hold oyster shell? Tensile shifts, so are they breaking down and losing strength, and how fast is that happening? And are there any harmful indicators such as mold growth or harmful sediment? So outcomes and final goals. As material explorations become more conclusive, public engagement through handmade processes is also being explored. And we're exploring possibilities such as home building kits or guides, so providing visual documents and tools publicly for people to potentially have a DIY approach to building these roosts from home. We're looking at building workshops and the possibility of that, while also engaging craft and manufacturing practitioner and expert engagement within potentially building workshops or an online forum, depending on where we're at. So these kind of approaches are informed by success stories within BirdLife's Nest Boxing for Native Birds project and Penguin Foundation's Knit for Nature. And alongside those, this project is additionally presenting opportunity to further stimulate wildlife education, conservation engagement at a grassroots level. So where next? Prototyping and testing will continue. And as we continue to become more informed in what's successful during that phase, we're going to begin to collaborate with lab and safety testing. So looking at any potential harmful growth on particular materials like mycelium and safety testing for birds. Engaging practitioners, so looking at handcrafts, local handcraft practitioners within Australia and South Korea, and looking at potentially creating some practice workshops and toolkit trials and seeing how they might unfold. So implementation of this work hopes to aid in future BirdLife Australia and BirdLife International's objectives of increased roost deployment and support along the East Asia-Australasian flyway, informed by a framework created to make responsible, holistic design decisions that can be applied to this project and others. That's a quick overview of the work. I hope that that's been insightful. I will stop sharing my screen now. Thank you very much.
It's fantastic, Lashna. Really encouraging and exciting stuff there. You know, really particularly interested in how we can take this project potentially into the social and economic realm for local communities, particularly within the Jungang Coast and Sochon County. They have taken the risk and bucked the trend of a lot of Korean counties in that they've backed the horse of ecotourism and heritage tourism as their large economic contribution over reclamation and industry. So they're not realising those potentials yet and still struggling with ecotourism. But they do, being a coastal community, they have a rich heritage in fishing and local handicrafts. So Lashna touched upon some of the local handcrafts, and particularly around the get bowl, they used to use hand-woven fishing nets and use of gourds as flotation devices. So it could feed back into their heritage and back into their local economy. So really exciting stuff. Any questions for Alex or Lashna at this stage? 3, 2, 1. Giving you the chance to...
Hi, Chris. Sorry, Liz Gould from Healthy Living.
That's okay, Liz. Good. Yep.
AWSG. Sorry, I keep starting to talk and not realising. That classic thing. Just wondering, so I'm sorry, Alex, I had to step out and I missed a bit of your presentation, but looking at what Lashna is doing, I think you're exploring opportunities to link with local economies and communities in design and production. And you mentioned just then, I guess what just triggered my interest, particularly there about the heritage implications in design. Are you looking within Australia as well as internationally in terms of heritage implications in design, in terms of our First Nations people and the tools and materials that they were using as well? Just interested in that.
Yes, absolutely. The project is looking at that quite closely, and we're hoping to potentially engage some local practitioners to see if some of their expertise can be applied to the project, and obviously they can benefit from the project as well.
Good stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, so if anybody does have any contacts that they can pass on from the regions, that would be really helpful. I think Lashna's already, I saw a really impressive prototype of using pandanus weaving, for example, which has been used for eons by our First Nation people for a plethora of applications. and also Tasmanian communities traditionally used kelp. So there are certain avenues that we would love to investigate, and if anybody has any networks which they think would be helpful, we'd love to hear from them.
Absolutely.
All right, well, if there aren't any further questions, I'll move on to a bit of the more practical phase for us, and a bit of a feedback phase about where we're going next. So to do so, I'll just put together some ideas about where we're going with phase 2 and potential directions, and then let's see. Then we'll move into more of a discussion. So just very quickly, phase 2. These are my thoughts and feelings. We've accumulated a lot of data. We've seen how these things work and are applied in situ, and we've had them relatively. Apart from very minor changes, we've kept them relatively consistent site to site. What I'd like to do now, particularly given the capacity and the demand for them in Korea, once that they're able to be, we're able to get back there, I'd like to upscale some of those and apply some layout changes. Getting into the minutiae of that's probably not practical within this meeting, but just to know that we will alter the roosts to bring them closer together, improve ability for birds to cluster a bit more, and provide more of a stable platform for them. And we'd like to encourage parallel independent efforts. So as I keep saying, we're just a small project, and we're running with this idea, but I'm really encouraging anybody out there, if they have the motivation and the resources to try their own floating roosts. I really want as many diverse applications and attempts at this as possible. I've got no interest in putting IP on it. I just want it to be the best possible end outcome for migratory shorebirds. So Port of Brisbane are an example. They tried a completely different, they took our idea and tried a different approach to it, using large square tubs filled with oyster shell. From initial results, they got most of the water birds on them, but perhaps that was just because the water wasn't filtrating through quite as much. But I'm interested to hear what everybody else is up to, and I do get contact from international and national initiatives who are engaging in different approaches, mostly for water birds and vegetation, but would be interested if people want to take on their own trials. We'd be happy to consult on how we can diversify them and get the best outcome for the broader project. Testing new materials, as we just heard from Lashna, both commercially and these bespoke ones which Lashna is investigating. The commercial aquaculture industry is always developing. Zapco Aquaculture is actually producing their initiative, which was born out of Marumbula Lakes, is now getting exported internationally. So they're a growing business and they're refining their product all the time. So we can progress with their new iterations. We're still using their 2018 products, but they've improved them since then. I'd like to hear some discussion about how we can improve monitoring, and Alex's and Ryan's studies are going to be key for that, for the thermal approaches. And yeah, I think from there we can easily move into a discussion about future of the project and whether we're still reaching our objectives, whether it's a worthwhile endeavour, or am I just too caught up in it and love learning how to tie knots and falling over in the water and dropping them off, watching shorebirds all day. So here are just some loose discussion points that I thought that could drive our discussion from here. and I'd be interested to hear from anybody, whether it's a comment or a question, as to whether these floating roosts are necessary in the Port Phillip Bay Ramsar site. I think from Danny's perspective, they're probably not necessary, but I would like to see them continue there as the ideal testing ground. And I think that we can certainly improve on how they're applied, and we can perhaps change sites, change layouts, change our objectives. So whether we include fairy tern, there's been some recent talk about fairy tern nesting opportunities down in the Snake Island Avalon complex. We can certainly adapt these to provide nesting opportunities, as we saw with pied stilt. That could be a possibility to investigate. And how does this contribute to the broader management plan for the Ramsar site? So perhaps that's a good place to jump off. And we're lucky enough to have Steve Close from the Migratory Shorebird team here, who's been doing some management planning with Rob Bone and the Corangamite CMA on shorebird values within the Port Phillip, Western Port, Port Phillip and Bellarine Ramsar site. We've also got contributors from Melbourne water experts like Will Steele and Sue Lynn Hayes who have joined us. So interested to hear your collective thoughts and any questions you might have. I assume everyone's just talking at the same time, but you've forgotten to take off your microphones.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris, for the overview. Fantastic presentation. And generally, yeah, we're working on many sites around Port Phillip Bay as well, particularly Avalon's Artworks, Snag Island, a few other sites. And I think what it's shown is that Port Phillip Bay is an ideal trial site for this methodology. I've sort of wondered along the side how and to what extent you're actually monitoring the buildup of biomass, and whether exploring different materials that might actually be a different take-up, in particular for mussels and other things building up on those roosts that would eventually cause them to sink or something. So the question there is that a problem already? Has that been considered? What sort of problems, or maybe even for other countries setting possibilities or chances, opportunities coming out of this might be there? I'm just thinking there might be a biomass buildup that could be used in some countries as a side income, even if there was a harvest of mussels and these kinds of things. So is that a problem already? Is that something you're watching, and to what extent do you expect that to be an issue?
Yeah, I expect that it will be an issue in some sites, and I think it's and unfortunately this isn't very scientific, but yeah, have you read the paper by Purnell and Purnell? It's called Suck It and See. We have to apply these roosts in certain places and see what does colonise them. I think one of the opportunities, so the trial actually utilised empty oyster shells, because we were not interested in the harvest of shell, and we had no commercial interest whatsoever. But in many sites in the Yellow Sea, they have very ecologically damaging oyster and mussel harvesting techniques. In China, for example, they put giant concrete poles and they drive them into the mudflat, and they'll drive hundreds of them for hectares into a large part of suitable habitat, and then simply scrape those poles to collect the oysters once they've grown. They'll seed them manually, and then they'll scrape them manually. So this is a really labour intensive, two ecologically damaging process to undergo. Now, it strikes me, and I've spoken to the guys from Zapco, they actually produce these bags, and all these things get shipped from China, but the Chinese are not yet using this new method for aquaculture. So similarly, in the Yellow Sea, in Korea rather, in the Junghung coast, this is a community which really still relies quite heavily on export of seafood. So they're this county is one of the major seafood exporters. And when you go to Seoul seafood market, a lot of the produce, particularly bivalves, comes from Shong County, but they have not been able to realise their full potential for oyster farming. So when we actually put this proposal together, a few ingenuitive and mussel farmers tried to start farming mussels in their traditional way, which is by dangling ropes from suspended fields, and again, very manual, very labour intensive. Whereas this method only requires one farmer to not only put out and maintain the site, but also harvest the oysters at the end of the day. So there is potential for a local economy, an active oyster farm, but also conservation outcomes for shorebirds. So they can go hand in hand. So it's similar to, I guess, when you consider salt fields being important shorebird habitat. If a salt field operator is maintaining a good salt field, it's good for shorebirds. Similarly for an oyster farm. As for spoiling, yeah, we just have to wait and see. And Lashna will probably agree that we'll have to apply the prototypes to different scenarios and see how they go actually out in situ.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I mean, if there's a great potential, if there could be a way that the floating bags, or generally, I don't want to say floating roosts, but these floating structures could find entrance into the local economies and actually be deployed for an economic reason and have the side effect of being roosts, that'd be fantastic. So rather than having to look after roosts, floating roosts, deploy them for that single purpose of providing roost space, if something was developed that could find entry into the local economy and just be deployed by the people growing maybe not oysters, maybe mussels or something like that, maybe even to float those lines that mussels are being grown on, that'd be a fantastic rollout in some areas. And I think especially for Asia, I can see huge potential there.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. That's a very good point. Yeah, we'd like to have the 360 sort of social, economic and conservation values all realised and working hand in hand. Obviously, coastal community, the coast is a very, as you know, and everyone on this call probably knows, use of coastal areas and their resources can be very, there has to be a lot of diplomacy in these shared spaces, and particularly when people are trying to earn a living from those resources as they are in these fishing communities. So hopefully we can contribute and, or at the very least not be detrimental to those communities. So how are people feeling? What are people's thoughts on, given the objectives of Port Phillip Bay, Ramsar site, and larger contributions to the flyaway, are different people out there feeling that this is still a worthwhile endeavour to pursue within Port Phillip Bay? And even if it is just a trial or testing ground, like we said before, we can project forward and think about how coastlines are potentially going to have increased perturbations and threats by sea level rise and habitat retreat, and how things like these might be applicable. But currently, are we still happy for this trial to run in Port Phillip Bay to get us to a project realisation phase?
Chris, if no one else is going to say anything, as a trial site, I'm happy that, yep, it's a nice and convenient spot for you to do trials and test the efficacy of these things. I'm not sure Western Treatment Plant is the best study site, because given your study hasn't convinced me that these things are preferred roosting habitat. That's the first thing, and that might just be that there's so much alternative natural roosting habitat there that they're not, you haven't shown that they've shown any kind of preference or for these structures. And my second concern is that I'm convinced if we do need additional roosting habitats at the Western Treatment Plant that a more natural, low maintenance, a simpler method is the way to go. So I don't see these, I might be proven wrong, of course, but I'm not sure I see these plastic structures having a real role in terms of conservation at the Western Treatment Plant. And because, as I say, you haven't convinced me, I'm afraid, that these are great roosting habitats. The thermal work will be interesting because that is a key factor of just what are their thermal characteristics. But you haven't convinced me that they are ideal or preferred or better than natural. And you didn't set out to convince me, but I'm pretty certain that a more natural approach in terms of natural placement of sand or other mechanisms that are lower maintenance, simpler, longer lasting are the way to go. So, as I said in the beginning, happy for the WTB to be a trial site and to test ideas, but I'm not thinking that we need this particular solution. I'm sure that there are other more effective solutions.
Yeah, thanks, Will. And they're all great points. I think that we always looked at the Port Phillip Bay as the, and Western Treatment Plant in particular, as the proof of concept, rather, that they would use them. Not that it was required and there was no necessity for it, because there are so many options and you guys have existing knowledge and management interventions which you can apply to create additional roosting habitat, and there is existing habitat already there. So that's why we're not seeing the results in the Western Treatment Plant, and why this isn't required for the Ramsar values of the site. But I think that at its very best, it is just the testing ground. So if you guys are happy for us to continue it as a testing ground to improve the product, then and you know, if I think the ultimate, as we keep saying, the ultimate outcome would be that these things aren't needed anywhere, because everyone's managing their coastlines like Melbourne Water and Parks Victoria do, and the CMA do in Western Port Phillip Bay. So I would like that to not have to have these in as few places as possible, and I think that's part of the roost threat matrix, which the Migratory Bird team has been working through with the federal government, assessing the most significant roosting sites and shorebird habitats in Australia, and the flowchart and decision tree for application of roosts negates need for them in 99.5% of sites within Australia, because there is alternative applications or interventions rather that can be done. So as you say, sand spits and managing of supratidal habitats. So yeah, thanks for your comments, Will. And that was Will Steele, by the way, from Melbourne Water, who's been leading a lot of the shorebird management and larger conservation management works through Western Treatment Plant for over a decade or a couple of decades now, Will, probably. But does anybody have anything to add to that? No? All right. Well, I think that if we're in agreement that it's a trial within Port Phillip Bay, and we're just seeking to use it as a experimentation site, and the local stakeholders are happy for us to continue there, and we might try to apply it in other sites. Danny suggested Mud Island. As I said before, I'd be interested to see it happen in Avalon as that continues along its management planning phase. Perhaps we won't need it in the Western Treatment Plan. I can't see any value in retaining a couple of those sites within Western Treatment Plant, because I think we've got all we have out of them. We are seeing we are still seeing them evolve, and the responses by some birds, we're seeing new stuff every month, but we can easily repurpose those existing roosts, tow them down the coast and apply them in a number of other sites. So example, Avalon and Mud Island. So perhaps I'll follow up with other local land managers after this call, and once I've sent out some minutes, and we'll investigate those options. Now, I am very well. Sorry, jump in. Who we got there?
Yeah, it's Rob Bone here, Chris. I'm just really struggling with connection today, unfortunately. So if I drop out, I apologise. But yeah, there are a couple of little sites that still exist within the Ramsar site that I think have been largely impacted by roost disturbance occurring at perhaps high tide areas or roost areas that are close to populations of people. You know, I think of the Barwon Estuary and parts of Swan Bay as well. They do get a fair bit of disturbance through dog walkers in areas like that. And I wonder whether some kind of roost trial or artificial roost setup would be beneficial to those sites. And it, you know, unfortunately Danny had to leave, but he'd probably be the best person to talk through some of that data that exists within a couple of those sites to understand whether that would be the case. We are looking at a little bit more in detail the Barwon Estuary at the moment to try and figure out why shorebirds have decreased somewhat in the last 10 to 15 years in their use of that site, particularly some of the larger shorebirds like eastern curlew. Similarly for Swan Bay, they're finding some of those larger shorebirds aren't using it as regularly as what they were perhaps 15, 20 years ago. Just some food for thought, I guess. I'd love to explore it, you know, where it's required, and yeah, Mud Islands definitely as well. But yeah, apologies for the connection issues today.
No, that was a good connection we had there, Rob. And I'm connecting with you on those ideas as well, because I think particularly with Swan Bay, what we saw from Danny is that birds are using it largely as a feeding area. If we can provide, and it's quite a sheltered lagoon system, we could easily deploy there. Barwon Estuary would be another one, interesting one. I'd love to look into that, and I'll follow up with yourself and Danny about that, particularly for larger shorebirds. As we heard from Danny again, they don't need to be feeding around the tide cycle, so they are largely happy just to roost at high tide, and a lot of the larger shorebirds are the ones that we're seeing within the Maroondah Lakes aquaculture system. So just sitting at the high tide, whereas the smaller shorebirds roost but also feed during the high tides on floating roosts. So yeah, really interested to see that, and the Mud Island option is interesting as well, both for shorebirds and other water birds which are out there. We might be able to, you know, given the amount of breeding water birds out there, you might actually get colonised by breeding ibis, which might not be ideal, but could be an interesting conservation outcome. I also just just thought crossed my mind about the disturbance which you were talking about, Rob, and other impacts to roosts and feeding areas in Victoria. The late great Clive Minton, I remember having a chat with him just before he left us, that he would like to see floating roosts. He thinks that they would be good to apply in a site in Corner Inlet where mangrove incursion has been a problem. So mangroves have grown over a historical roost site which had a bird hide at it. They've cleared out the line of view for the bird hide, but there's still no roosting opportunities. So a floating roost beyond the mangroves could be an option to push out the roosting opportunities further into the inlet. I was just thinking of that because Barwon Estuary obviously has high visitation, and we are considering this as could consider it as an educational tool. So the Koreans have put up educational signage at vantage points where people can see the roosts and see the birds on the roost, and are using it as an educational tool for tours going out of the bird village there. So just another angle to investigate.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And that's very similar to, as you say, what's happening in the Barwon Estuary with mangrove incursion, a fairly large impact there as well as disturbance. But some of those areas that talked about in Swan Bay too, so Edwards Point used to be a really good roost site, and now it's getting a lot more foot traffic and dog walker use that are getting quite close to those roost sites that tend to be impacted now as well. So definitely an opportunity there, I would have thought. And look, Danny at the moment is undertaking with another consultant a bit of a review on shorebird use of the Barwon Estuary, so I can flick that report through to you when we're finished with it, hopefully in the next couple of months.
That'd be great, Rob. Yeah, interested to see the results, and I think any management planning, and you guys are well across this, would look at managing the threat first, and this is what we said about the decision tree. So either removing mangroves or removing that disturbance as the long-term goal. But in the meantime, if we did have a temporary need to deploy one of these roosts, that could provide a temporary relief for the local population and also contribute to the trial. So considering that these are the sort of last emergency room sort of intervention. But ultimately, again, in the LOC, they don't have those options. There is no turning back some of these sites. So we need to think about these either being long-term interventions, which is a bit of a sad state of affairs, or identify how we can perhaps influence local governments to restore habitat retreat options and improve roosting, natural roosts, which would mean significant infrastructure alterations and undamming of tidal creeks and rivers. So a lot to consider there. So in the meantime, when these birds are travelling through, we can deploy the floating roosts to stave off some of the effects. Liz, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. I just, Rob raised something, I put it in the chat, but really interested in the angle on disturbed sites. We have a lot of that up in southeast Queensland. We also have a lot of mangrove encroachment, and obviously that's all protected under fisheries legislation. So there's difficulties associated with permits. I mean, obviously mangroves are providing really important habitat in fisheries, nurseries and things like that. But it was more that disturbance angle. So most of the birds that we have up in SEQ are being disturbed by people, either while they're foraging or while they're roosting. We're about to do a census starting tomorrow of roost sites across the region to sort of identify which sites are being used by which birds, get a total species and numbers, but also do some systematic monitoring of disturbance at those sites. It's only one day, it's a snapshot, but anyway. And I'm just sort of interested in whether in your determining where you're placing these, the most of the sites you mentioned so far don't seem to be particularly subject to human disturbance. And I wondered whether you had any I don't know whether it's guidelines. We'd be probably up here wanting to trial in locations where we don't really have people, because people are the problem. So trying to find more remote locations and building on, I guess, also that other thought that came through about the opportunities for communities to harvest from those. Again, we have a lot of people harvesting in our mudflats for fisheries purposes, but even for human food purposes, as it is with sort of quite diverse cultures in our region. And I can see that people might start to, manipulate the use of floating roosts for their own purposes to suit their own recreation, social, food needs as well. And I just wondered if you've had much in that space where you've been trialling, with obviously right next to a capital city being Brisbane and Moreton Bay being huge visitation, recreational use of the bay is just going to keep increasing, and yeah, just difficult.
Yeah. Well, the only close comparison that I can draw is I haven't mentioned the hunter estuary trial during this workshop. One, because it was we're focusing on Port Phillip Bay, but also because it didn't have as tight a monitoring scheme, but it also didn't get as much use because in the necessity, there's a larger network of roost sites existing within that system. But the hunter estuary trial, two of the 3 roost sites are accessible to quite a large community. So there's one under the bridge at Stockton Sands Pit and one in Kooragang Dykes, both heavily used areas by fishermen. So there was a lot of interaction and mixed use objectives for those areas, and we didn't have any interference with the roost. People generally were a little bit curious, but we didn't leave any cameras out there, mind you. But they were curious, but didn't really interfere with the structures themselves. And from local reports, there's some pretty unsalubrious people who get around under the bridge at Stockton. So we were encouraged by that. And both of those sites are subject to high disturbance. So as you probably have noticed in some of those areas, and similarly to Merimbula Lakes, which was the inspiration for the trial, is that certain populations, particularly with the larger shorebirds, because they show such high site fidelity when they're returning, and we've seen that through tracking studies and leg flag re-sightings, that they come back to the same non-breeding sites year on year often, that some of them are more habituated to disturbance than others. So there is obviously a tipping point, and I think Moreton Bay is probably that high use there is a real limitation for the shorebirds and the amount of disturbance. But yeah, offsetting these things by 20, 30 metres from where people might be able to access might be sufficient for birds who are habituated to seeing a lot of humans. Boating is a tricky one, and we had to negotiate with wreck fishers and a lot of the port authorities around the hunter to install there. But yeah, people are curious, but unlikely to go and deliberately disturb birds, in my opinion. But yeah, that's one of the advantages, I guess. You can put them out deeper. Dog walkers who are going out on sand spits and doing undesirable things, you can isolate them, and you can move them relatively easily as well if you're finding they are too close to any of those disturbances. I know that you had several questions in there, Liz, but I probably only answered one of them.
That's good, thank you.
Chris, I have to jump off now. I've got to run into another meeting, but I just wanted to thank you for the update today. It's all looking really interesting and promising, particularly in those Korean sites. So we're looking forward to receiving the report or the technical manual when it's available. Yep. And we're also really keen to still showcase these trials or the rollout of these floating roost trials in our bilateral migratory bird meetings, hopefully next year if travel restrictions ease, but also the flyway mop and the Convention on Migratory Species is also really keen on the findings of these trials. So I just wanted to make that point, and yeah, wish you all the very best for the next phase.
Yeah, so that brings up, I just quickly want to discuss the project realisation goals. So, and this is probably something that Lashna has a better idea on. At what stage do we consider it a final product or a suitable product to be deployed in our end purpose habitats, being the LOC? Do we rapidly get them out as an unfinished unrealised product, or do we wait until we've got something that's really tickety-boo and unshakable, which, you know, it is a complex project, and there are, when you're dealing with projects, when you're dealing with birds and intertidal environments and unknown materials, it could take 3 or 4 years. So do we forge ahead? What's the realisation goals? And Lashna, do you know, how do you normally step out project realisation and products?
Usually it can be quite iterative. If, for example, but it can be quite unpredictable too, which is maybe not the best thing to hear, but but it can be good in that regard, that if, for example, the pandanus weave that you saw in December, we trial and it looks really promising, then we can focus on that and potentially fast track something. But if it doesn't work and it breaks down in a week or two and that's not appealing, then we go back and try again with a different material. So it can be quite an iterative process that can take time, or if we find something that works, it can happen quicker than we thought. So it really depends on how the material is going to act in situ. But in terms of the master's time frame, that I hope to give you something, a proof of concept, a final prototype that's complete and ready to go, end of 2022.
Fantastic, thanks, Lashna. Yeah, so I just wanted to add that in there, just to temper people's expectations. I know a lot of people are following it and want to see a final product, but we might not get there, and as Lashna, right away. And it's taken, you know, 2 years to get where we are with the results we have, to decide, and we're still, you know, trying to decide where and how we go ahead. So it is an iterative process, and yeah, I think people should progress with their shorebird management in traditional methods, and if we can get these back out into the LOC as soon as possible, then that's great. So thanks for your input there. All right. Well, are there any more questions or comments that we want to address here? Otherwise, I'm happy to take have a look at the chat, and people are free to contact me offline. Okay. Well, I think we have done quite well in our input there at the end, and I've learnt a lot from you guys. So thanks for your input and giving me a bit of external perspective, which can be hard to get, and in the minutiae of everyday maintenance of the roosts. So that's been very useful. I have recorded this, so I'll hopefully perhaps make some snippets out of the recording, but I'll get some minutes together and some ideas about next steps and forward them around to the group if everyone's happy for me to do that. Otherwise, feel free in the meantime to get in touch with me with any further ideas or opinions or comments, and I'll try to incorporate them as well.
Thanks very much.
All right.
Thanks,
guys.
Thanks, Chris. Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. Cheers, mate. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks very much.